Welcome back to Cadet Rob 1985's U.S. Army Enlisted Insignia. So this I think is another redo. Been doing a lot of research lately and updating many of my pages, and this is one that I've spent a lot of time working on. So let's look into it. All right, the U.S. Army Enlisted Insignia. So going back all the way to the Revolutionary War, I think the U.S. Army has changed their insignia more than any other service, which is kind of incredible since the Navy is about the same age as the Army, and they have had way fewer changes to their insignia. In fact, the Navy's insignia is probably one of the most stable of all the services, other than their rates. But let's let's go ahead and take a look. So in 1775, we have our Revolutionary War insignia. There's no actual insignia, but the actually decided what the different insignia, such as it was, would be for the different ranks. And for a corporal, they would wear a strip of green cloth sewn to their right shoulder, and a sergeant would wear a stripe of red cloth. These ranks go back even before this time period. And corporals, the word is French, meaning the head, right, to lead a group of soldiers. And a sergeant comes from the Latin for servant. And earlier, sergeants would be the leader or servants of an officer, right, kind of their assistant, their right-hand man, which kind of still goes through till today, right, that the top sergeants help the leader of the various units, all the way from a platoon all the way up to an army. And then in 1776, they came out with the sergeant major. There was no special insignia. General von Steuben was a Prussian who helped George Washington really whip the Continental Army into shape, and he created von Steuben's Blue Book, which was kind of like a drill book to really help officers and soldiers understand everything from proper how to set up a camp to how like a regiment should be organized and all that, and how to drill, the whole 9 yards. And he recommended that there be the private soldier, the corporal, the sergeant, the first sergeant, which would lead, along with the officer, a troop or a company or a battery, would be the top enlisted soldier in that level, in charge of standards and training, and then a sergeant major at that regiment level, right? So those were his recommendations he followed. But, the Continental Army was kind of, not the best at following standards, let's put it that way. All right, so then we move on to the beginning of insignia and so this is kind of a big skip. I can't find any really definitive sources between the Revolutionary War, the Continental Army, and 1847. I think that up until then, soldiers they wore the uniform. The Army was very small in any case during most of this time period, and they wore a uniform, and they didn't, everybody knew who the corporals and the sergeants were, and they just didn't wear any identifying insignia. But in 1847, that's when they really started coming out with it. And so you'll see that foot soldiers wore white insignia and cavalry troops wore yellow. This was really the first, definitions between. Corporal wore 2 stripes. It's interesting that in many cases throughout the history of United States insignia, that many times they skip. When they first instituted insignia, they skip 1 stripe. They go straight to 2. But anyways, corporal has 2 stripes. Sergeant has 3. The first sergeant has 3 with a diamond, right? And then the quartermaster has 3 chevrons with 3 straight rocker bars, and then a sergeant major has 3 chevrons with 3 bent or curved or rockers underneath it. And just like before, this is right out of von Steuben. The only thing new is the quartermaster sergeant you know. Yeah. Then moving forward into the Civil War era, this is where you start seeing more stripes, different colors, and you also see that the army that was dominated before more dominated by infantry. And so, the big battles in the Civil War are fought, with infantry supported by artillery and cavalry and all the others. But infantry is the main troops. And so you see mostly blue chevrons, in paintings and representations of movies, right? And so kind of the same ranks as before. The new addition really then is that they flip the chevrons over, and you see the ordnance sergeant with the star, and then the company level quartermaster sergeant, at least in the cavalry and the artillery and the sharpshooters, but not in the infantry. Okay. The Indian Wars, through the Spanish-American War, the chevrons change a little bit. They get a little thinner and they get a little wider, which I didn't think was even possible, but they do. And you see some new positions being added, especially once you get past the 1870s into the 1880s and 1890s. You're going to see the music sergeant, as well as the other, and so on. But once you move into the 1880s, you're going to see the saddle sergeant, the chief trumpeter, commissary sergeant, hospital assistant steward, the hospital steward, the commissary. It changes from the downward facing moon to the leftward facing moon, and then the quartermaster sergeant and the color sergeant. The color sergeant is a really important position. It had been a position since 1840, but now it gets its own insignia. And the color sergeant actually carries the flag at the front of the thing. And you see this even back as far as the Civil War, but now is actually a position. You had to be an NCO usually in the past to do it, but now it's got its own insignia. All right, so then in 1892, you see they add the lance corporal, right? Which most people would think of as a private, but it's a lance corporal, and most people today would think of that as a Marine Corps rank, but apparently it goes back in the Army quite some time. Most of the rest of those are still the same as before. Some new positions in 1899. The chief musician, the squadron master sergeant, which was a cavalry only position. So you can see that they just sort of kept expanding. Seems like every time they simplify the ranks in the Army, then they spend the next 20 or 40 or 60 years afterwards, expanding them. So here's the same sort of thing. In World War I, they did kind of try to go back to basics, but so they started off with only, I think, like 20 or 30 rank insignia, because of the different branches and things, but then they just went crazy. Almost 128 or 136, depending on the sources you look at, just different patches. And if you go to my website, you can find the complete World War I patch. And I also have another video, and I'll link all that in the thing below. And so you can see all the World War I era patches. It's pretty incredible. But you can see they kind of stripped it back down. Private, first class, lance, corporal, sergeant, first sergeant, color sergeant, which that used to be the ordnance sergeant, right, with the star, the battalion sergeant major, and the regimental sergeant major. So you see now they put the first sergeant down at the company level instead of the battalion where it was before. All right, and then in between the wars, this is when the grade system comes in, right? The grade 1 through 7. and a new position, and then the disappearance of the sergeant major, which comes back later. But and so this is also the first appearance of the staff sergeant, right? You saw some insignia in the World War I period that looked like staff sergeant, but really wasn't staff sergeant. So we have, private first class, corporal, sergeant, sergeant, technical sergeant. So this is interesting. This is something that will eventually morph into the Air Force technical sergeant after World War II is over, and will disappear from the Army when they spin off the Air Force. So that's kind of interesting. And then your first sergeant and master sergeant. So then, in the middle of World War II, they bring in these technical grades, and the technical grades are there to really just give a place for specialists to gain rank without gaining command. So the technicians are not a command position, but it lets them move up in grade and get more pay without assuming any command. All right. Then you can see that they move in September of that same year. They switch the first sergeant from grade 2 to grade 1, and they give him the extra stripe. So, all right. Then during the Korean War, they come up with these crazy stripes that you'll never see hardly anywhere outside of a textbook or a website. I've never seen granted, they were only in use for 3 years, and everybody in the Army hated them. So anyways, here they are. They got rid of the grade 6 insignia and just left private with nothing. And so then a private first class had 1 stripe, and a corporal had 2. And then the sergeant was moved from grade 4. I think where was the sergeant before? The sergeant was a grade 4. Moved from grade 4 to grade 3, and they got rid of the 3-stripe buck sergeant, and it replaced it with this, abomination where you go from 2 to 4 stripes. I don't know what they were thinking. And then the other big abomination is the entire idea of the blue on gold for the combat troops and the gold on blue for the non-combatants. It wasn't popular with anybody, and a lot of people thought, especially once the war, got, and it was, and that they were tiny little insignia too. They were much smaller stripes than in the past. Nobody liked them. So in 1952, they used the same pattern, the same system, but they made them more traditional color and more traditional size. Plus the green on dark blue or dark black color just was better, on the fatigue uniforms. And as we move into the 1955, the post-Korean War era, they bring in the specialist ranks. So you have your specialist third class, and your specialist second class, and your specialist first class, and your master specialist. And so third class, second class, first class, master specialist. And these replace those old technical ranks, right? Remember the technical ranks that we had before in World War II that had kind of disappeared after World War II. They were brought back to World War I, and if you look at my other video on World War I, you'll see that they had this somewhat of a similar idea all the way back then. And they just keep recycling this idea that soldiers who do more technical work, they need an opportunity, and so you see this kind of schizophrenic split in the Army between them, and then they decide they don't like it and they get rid of it, and then they bring it back. So, but anyways, all right. So in 1959, we see this restructuring from the old grade system again to the E system, right? So from 7 grades to 9 enlisted rank grades, or whatever you want to call it. All right, so we start with the recruit and the private still have no insignia, and then but they do bring back the sergeant. So you have your private, first class, corporal, and sergeant. They bring back the old buck sergeant, which is like goes back almost to the beginning of insignia in the Army. I can't believe they tried to get rid of it. And then you have your staff sergeant, your sergeant first class, master sergeant. All this is still kind of the same. But they bring in these specialists, right? And so starting at E4, you have your specialist 4, then 5, 6, 7, right? And they did this thing with the national emblem on this strange looking patch. I mean, I guess it's kind of the inside of a regular patch just turned upside down. I don't know what you would call this interior of between a chevron and a rocker. I don't even know if it has a name. If anybody knows, please tell me what the background of what's now just a specialist insignia is called. But then they just added rockers to the top for 5 and 6 and 7. And then these inverted chevrons for 8 and 9. 8 and 9 don't last very long. This only 5 years, I think. And then they got rid of them and converted those few troops that had them over from specialist 8 and 9 to master sergeant, sergeant major, because they were kind of commanding specialist troops, and so they kind of needed to be have that command rank. And so this goes all the way through Vietnam, like this, through 1967. And this is when, in 1966, they'd been wearing these patches also on the fatigues, which is interesting. The fatigues were almost very colorful, the green utility uniforms. So then they bring out this subdued version of the patches, and it's no different. All the ranks are the same. Oh, there's a new rank that I almost forgot. Also in 1965, they bring in the command sergeant major, right? So they, just like the other services, they start splitting, like the Air Force is the worst at this, splitting the top ranks into more and more sub-ranks. So now we have 2 E8s. Of course, we've had up here, we have, 2 E4s, 2 E5s, E6, 7, 8, 3 E8s here, and 2 E9s. But now, as we move down, now we have the command sergeant major. So we have 2 E9s. So we have the sergeant major, which is more a staff position, and then with the command sergeant major. Same with master sergeant, which now has been more of a staff position. And you have your first sergeant, which is a command position. Okay, and then moving forward, right? Oh, we had the private first class. So you can see before there was no rank for private. Now we have a rank. They moved the PFC single chevron down to E2, and the private first class with a rocker. It's kind of similar to the Lance Corporal in the Marine Corps rank. Okay, so other than that, not many changes. But then in 1967, they also bring out the subdued black metal insignia to wear on field uniforms, the utilities. That way you don't have to constantly sew on and off patches when you get promoted, which in the military, in a war situation, often they can get promoted, especially at the lower ranks, E1 through E5. You can get promoted pretty fast in a combat situation. And so they decided they didn't want to have soldiers constantly having to sew patches on their uniform. Everything else pretty much stays the same. And then in 1975, they bring in the shiny brass metal insignia. This is like for raincoats and windbreakers, things like that at first, but they kind of expand it to others as they move along. Then in 1978, they dropped the Specialist 7 as they slowly keep getting rid of the Specialist ranks. So kind of that's still all the same. Then in 1979, they bring on the Sergeant Major of the Army, which is interesting because the Air Force had a position similar to this for quite some time. But now they bring it on. So it has 2 stars, just like the Sergeant Major had 1 star. The Sergeant Major of the Army has 2 stars. This is a senior enlisted advisor position to the Secretary of the Army and the Chief of Staff of the Army. So then in 1981, they bring out shoulder marks. In the 80s, they switched the shirt, the old the OD green, not the OD green, the dress green uniform of the Army. Used to have kind of a khaki colored shirt that didn't have any epaulets or anything. It was just black tie and a khaki shirt with the green jacket over it. But in the 80s, they switched over to kind of a lime green shirt, which had epaulets. So they could now use these shoulder marks when they were in an office situation, taking off their jacket. Also, that they had a sweater, a black sweater. I don't know if the Army still has this, but I know they did in the 80s. And they could wear the shoulder marks on that as well. You notice the shoulder marks start at corporal. Even the Specialist 4 did not have shoulder marks, but Specialist 5 and up and Corporal and up had the shoulder marks. So probably because lower ranking troops, one, didn't have the money for all those extra things other than the green shirt, and they didn't have an opportunity to wear that shirt without the jacket very often anyways. And it was just an additional expense considering the rapidity in which they get promoted in those first couple of years of service. So, all right, Cold War, 1985. They finally dropped the E5, the Specialist 5 and Specialist 6, and they renamed Specialist 4 Specialist. But other than that, everything stays the same. So we do have our two grades at E4, and this is something that is still all the way through till today. And the rest of these ranks, they're not going to change much, right? You're not going to see hardly any change. This is kind of from E1 through E9. This is pretty much the set of ranks that goes through till today. So 1985 was the date where we kind of settled on those. So you got your recruit, your private first class, specialist, corporal, sergeant, staff sergeant, sergeant first class, master sergeant, first sergeant, right? So 2 E8 grades, right? Staff and command, and then sergeant major. I think at one point it was even called staff sergeant major. I'll have to look that up. And then command sergeant major, and then you have your sergeant major of the Army, right? And so all of your insignia, subdued, and brass, and shoulder marks. Then in the Gulf War era, in 1994, they changed the Sergeant Major of the Army insignia over from the 2 stars to the 2 stars stayed, but became much smaller, and then they put the national emblem in between there. Other than that, everything else stays exactly the same, right? And then in 2006, they phased out the old Army greens. The Army green uniform had been around since quite some time, and since I guess the 1950s, when it replaced the pinks and greens, and then they brought in the Army service uniform, the dress blues uniform. And so really the only change here is that the insignia is no longer golden light on green, right? But now a slightly different shade of golden light on blue, okay, which is a blue-black kind of color, midnight blue. Then all the other insignia pretty much stays the same. And then in 2019, you see the change back to the updated pinks and greens. And I did miss one thing. Let me go back to 2006. That's also when they brought in the senior enlisted advisor to the chairman rank. Enlisted, so that's a new rank. That's when the position came in. I don't think the rank actually came in on that date. I don't have a firm date on that. But in 2019, then the new pinks and greens are coming out. They won't be fully phased in until, I believe, 2024, when it'll be mandatory, I think, for all troops to wear those. The Army dress blues are not going away. That's just becoming more of a dress uniform. The everyday business uniform, you'd say, of the Army, though, is going to be the updated new pinks and greens uniform. All the other insignia still hangs around, the black pin-ons, the brass pin-ons, the slip-ons. There's plenty of uniform parts that will use all of those pieces. They're not going away that I'm aware of. So, but we're still kind of new to the pinks and greens era, so things could still change a little bit as we go forward into that. All right, please like, share, comment, subscribe, and visit my website. It's all going to be in the comment section below.